fighter jets engage UFOs in a dogfight over a nuclear-armed Air Force base in England.
The pilot was trying to be the hunter and not the prey.
Servicemen encounter a craft of unknown origin in the Rendlesham forest.
It was white light sphere when we got close to it. It was blinding.
There's no doubt about it. This is weird.
Then a sergeant touches the UFO and receives a telepathic alien code.
All of these significant sites around the world are captured in the Rendlesham Code.
What Royal Air Force secret about UFOs did Winston Churchill say would create mass panic if revealed?
It was quite serious, and they didn't want these conclusions to be released.
And has the British government been concealing an earth-shattering message from extraterrestrials? August 1944, World War II. In the early morning light of daybreak, over the English Channel, a Royal Air Force plane is returning to England from a top-secret reconnaissance mission over occupied Europe. As the aircraft approaches the English coast, the crew reports something unusual. What follows next will mark the beginning of the modern British UFO experience and launch a half-century of denials and cover-ups by the UK government.
A Royal Air Force reconnaissance mission was returning from Europe and flying up the east coast of the UK when they were shadowed by a UFO.
According to reports, the strange object was metallic and disc-shaped in appearance.
This object approached the aircraft, followed it, took no hostile action, but clearly this was something of great concern to the crew.
In the crew's report, they claim the encounter ended when the mysterious craft accelerated away and disappeared.
Some feel that these objects were intelligently controlled. This was made very clear by the pilot reports and declassified government documents. But in the end, the question is, did the object come from here or from somewhere else?
This report went to the Air Ministry, and one assumes that it went up the chain of command, and it may well have found its way to Winston Churchill himself. Years later, one of Churchill's bodyguards during the Second World War described a meeting between Churchill and Eisenhower when apparently this UFO sighting, along with other similar incidents, were discussed.
In fact, according to recently declassified British government files, in the meeting with General Eisenhower, Prime Minister Churchill states this event should be immediately classified, since it would create mass panic among the general population and destroy one's belief in the church.
Churchill worried about mass hysteria. They're all afraid of this information becoming public. These crafts are coming and visiting, and they could be described as nothing other than UFOs. So they really fear that the public couldn't handle it.
Certainly, if the Americans and the British government were sharing information about UFOs, then by that time, Churchill certainly already knew that there were extraterrestrial spacecraft and aliens.
Could Churchill's response represent the beginnings of the British government's modern-day preference to cover up all knowledge about UFOs? Even so, within a few years, reports of unidentified flying objects in Britain were becoming widespread. By 1952, aware of the rapid rise in credible UFO sightings, Churchill demands answers from the Secretary of State for the Royal Air Force in this rarely seen memo, stating, "What does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? What is the truth?"
There is no dispute about the authenticity of this document. This is Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, writing to his science advisor saying, "What does this stuff about flying saucers amount to?" I have seen the original of this document in the UK's National Archives. I have handled it.
Churchill's asking, and he gets this bland, kind of meaningless answer from his Air Ministry saying, "Well, we've conferred with the Yanks on this, and we agree with them that most of these sightings are fully explainable as natural phenomena, misidentifications, and so forth." It's very clear that their response more or less ruled out the extraterrestrial solution as a likely possibility.
But the position outlined for Churchill did not match what the Air Ministry was doing behind closed doors.
Behind the scenes, the reality was very different. There was a serious research and investigation underway because there was at least one UFO sighting per week being reported and investigated by the Ministry of Defense.
So just this simple fact that the British had really high-ranking military people looking at the issue showed it was a problem, even though they were denying it to the public.
Why was Winston Churchill and the British government so determined to cover up any and all information about UFOs? Was it really to prevent a fear of mass hysteria or erosion of belief in the church? Or could there have been something else, something much more profound that the British government wanted to hide?
What would be the reason for this secrecy on this subject for all these years? Well, one obvious reason is that they thought it was quite serious and they didn't want these conclusions to be released.
What we have is effectively the intelligence community trying to sweep the issue under the carpet. And I think it's arguably the beginning of the UFO cover-up.
If the governments can't tell us why UFOs are here, and we have no protection or countermeasures against them, then that is a concern.
Is it possible the British government engaged in a cover-up because they knew their military was powerless against UFOs with far more superior capability? To prove this, investigators need physical evidence and corroboration, and some believe such evidence exists in a case concealed from the public for nearly 14 years. Coming up.
It's multiple objects making incredible maneuvers. That was really impossible for conventional aircraft.
This is essentially a dogfight, where the pilot was trying to be the hunter and not the prey.
In the 1950s, despite sightings by the Royal Air Force, the British government publicly denied there was credible UFO evidence, but secretly, they took the threats so seriously that a committee of intelligence chiefs met regularly to discuss the issue.
This small group of secret keepers have been controlling the cover-up and the narrative of the UFO phenomena for decades.
And one of the best documented UFO events keeping British authorities on edge occurs on August 13th, 1956, just 80 miles northeast of London at the Bentwaters and Lakenheath Royal Air Force bases. Both partly used by the US Air Force due to the Cold War, and both suspected of having stockpiles of nuclear weapons. It was 9:30 p.m. when a radio operator at Bentwaters tracks an unidentified object approaching the base from the east at an apparent speed of over 4,000 miles per hour.
So they're tracking it, and it's coming in fast. Now, to put that in context, in 1956, the top airspeed of any fighter jet was about 1,000 miles per hour, roughly.
Well, this is 4 times as fast as anything flying at the time. And clearly, people are absolutely flummoxed as to how to respond to this, but they scramble jets to intercept this.
T-33 jet interceptors are sent racing to investigate the radar contact and are able to see and track the UFO briefly.
This was definitely something new that was outmaneuvering and outperforming the jets, but it was also something they couldn't shoot down.
Then something even more shocking occurs.
And then you get another radar tracking of 10 or 12 very slow-moving radar targets moving at maybe 100 miles per hour, very, very slow airspeed, that then converge on the radar to a very large radar blip, much larger than a standard commercial airliner. And then this object takes off, I believe, at a pretty good speed.
Both the earlier object and the much larger one disappear off radar. 30 minutes later, another unidentified target is detected, approaching at a speed estimated at 2,000 to 4,000 miles per hour. Then strangely, the target fades from the scope as it passes directly over the base. At that moment, an American flying above the base reports in.
It was a pilot of a C-47, like a transport plane. It's like, holy smokes, this incredibly fast object just zoomed by under my aircraft.
Bentwaters alerts the Lakenheath base 40 miles away to look out for the target.
They actually request that they put people out there to see what's going on. And they do. There are ground personnel at Lakenheath who see unidentified light phenomenon that they cannot figure out what this is.
The Royal Air Force scrambled 2 jets to try to intercept this UFO. Now, these pilots are flying the cutting-edge technology that the British have, and yet the UFO takes evasive action, maneuvers, and gets behind these pilots.
So instead of him pursuing it, it's just tailing him, and he's going through a series of dramatic maneuvers to shake this object.
Despite the pilot's violent evasive action, he's unable to outmaneuver the UFO.
The pilot said he was overcome with excitement, but he was also scared. This is essentially a dogfight taking place in the sky, where you're trying to be the hunter and not the prey. And when someone gets behind you, that's when it gets concerning.
We actually have a transcript of the conversation between these 2 pilots as this incident is unfolding, and it reads, "Did you see anything? I saw something, but I'll be damned if I know what it was. What happened? He, or it, got behind me, and I did everything I could to get behind him, and I couldn't. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen."
In terms of evidence, you really can't get any better than this. Here we have 2 experienced pilots talking about a UFO event. They're trained observers. The evidence really doesn't get any better than this.
The Bentwaters case is fascinating because it's classic UFO behavior. It's multiple objects being spotted on radar, being sighted by people on the ground, making incredible maneuvers really impossible for conventional aircraft.
Still, given the witnesses and documentation, the British government dismisses the entire incident. They tell the public the event was the result of false radar readings and meteoric activity.
It definitely wasn't meteors. We have the pilot reports, we have the transcriptions of their conversations. What was it? It was definitely something different.
I would say the likelihood of that object being a meteor under the C-47 is basically 0.
Real answers were quietly released 13 years later, in 1969, not by the British, but by the US Air Force. The scientific study of unidentified flying objects, overseen by physicist Edward Condon, seen here for the first time on national television, reached far more astonishing conclusions, saying, if any credence can be given to the maneuvers of the objects as sighted visually and by radar, the meteor hypothesis must be ruled out, and the probability that at least one genuine UFO was involved appears to be fairly high.
The facts of this case can't be denied. This is an absolute truth. The pilots saw the UFO, the radar operators tracked it, the US government concluded that this was real.
Despite the growing evidence of UFO incursions near nuclear-armed military bases, the British government continues to hide the truth from the public. But in the years ahead, another far more profound UFO event becomes the best documented case in history, and a public relations nightmare for decades. Coming up.
It is a landed, structured craft of some sort.
There's some type of strange flashing light ahead. Pieces of it are shooting off. There is no doubt about it. This is weird.
Since World War II, researchers believe that the British government has been concealing what they know about UFOs. But then in 1980, one of the most sensational series of UFO events in history occurs once again at the Bentwaters Air Force Base, which was also where a dogfight between UFOs and Air Force pilots occurred. And what follows, according to investigators, is a vast effort to alter records, coerce witnesses, and dispose of evidence of a UFO landing site in Rendlesham Forest.
The Rendlesham Forest lies between the military bases of Bentwaters and Woodbridge. These were US military bases on British soil.
Cold War was still going full force. There was a lot of tension, actually, in Eastern Europe at the time. The base at RAF Bentwaters, where this occurred, is widely understood to have nuclear ordnance, still unofficial to this day. They won't admit it, but we all know they've had it.
The story begins the day after Christmas, 1980, in the early morning hours, around 3 a.m.
The incident starts with strange lights being seen in the forest. And the initial thought is that perhaps some aircraft has crashed and maybe there's a fire.
John Burroughs, one of two key witnesses, was only 19 years old at the time. He struggled to come to terms with his experience ever since.
It just looked like the forest was lit up, like a Christmas light display. As we were getting closer to it, we had problems with our radios where we weren't able to communicate on base. They didn't hear us, we didn't hear them. There was like a static electricity in the air. And things seemed to slow down and things didn't feel right. And then all of a sudden, whatever it was in the forest in front of us. When we got close to it, it was blinding.
As Burroughs stays back to cover the sergeant, Peniston moves forward and slowly enters the light. Once inside, he finds something absolutely shocking.
It is a landed, structured craft of some sort. Triangular in shape, and it appears to have come down in a small clearing. Peniston is an experienced sergeant, trained in aircraft recognition, said subsequently, this was like no aircraft I have ever seen.
He's described it many times as kind of a pyramid triangle shape.
Peniston, later he said he walked around it, and he said this took place over a 45-minute period. And then what I remember was it went up in the air and then left.
If the encounter ended here, it would have likely been written off by the press as bored servicemen working on base during the Christmas holiday, attempting to have some fun. But it's what happens in the next 24 hours that makes the Rendlesham Forest incident the most famous UFO event in British history. That's because, on the following evening, Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt and a small team of military investigators head out to examine the site where Peniston and Burroughs had reported seeing the UFO.
Now, it was Colonel Halt's custom to take with him a handheld cassette recorder to document his thoughts and observations.
For UFO researchers, the Halt tape, never before heard on national television, represents undeniable proof not only that UFOs exist, that one had actually landed in Rendlesham Forest.
Okay, we're now approaching what looks like a blasted or scrubbed up area here.
Right away, the investigators find evidence of damaged trees.
There's a round abrasion on the tree about 3.5, 4 inches diameter, 3.5 feet off the ground. Each one of these trees is facing into the blast, what we assume is a landing site, all having abrasion, facing in the same direction towards the center.
The team also uses a Geiger counter to check the clearing for radioactivity.
We get a high reading. What does that mean? We are getting an indication of a heat source coming out of that center spot. Looks like heat or some form of energy.
What they find are elevated radiation levels in the middle of the clearing.
The highest levels of radiation are found in the 3 indentations, where the UFO apparently came down on almost like a tripod-like device, 3 landing struts.
The evidence suggests that Lieutenant Colonel Halt and his men are standing on the site of an actual UFO landing site. Then suddenly, another even more shocking development occurs.
After they conduct this search and assessment of the radioactivity levels, most spectacularly of all, we hear on tape Colonel Halt and his team encounter the UFO themselves.
Lieutenant Colonel Halt's voice becomes noticeably stressed.
There it is. Hey, I see it too. What is it? We don't know, sir. Is there some type of strange flashing light ahead? It is definitely coming this way. Pieces of it are shooting off. There is no doubt about it. This is weird.
The taped evidence indicates Halt and his men are witnessing a highly unusual aerial object moving through the forest. The investigators hurry to get a better view. But when they step into a second clearing, yet another UFO suddenly appears in the sky directly above them. This one sends a beam of light down to the ground just in front of them.
Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
Nearly 40 years later, the British and American government still refuse to admit that the evidence clearly shows that the military not only encountered UFOs in Rendlesham Forest, but were targeted by one. Perhaps their lack of candor is due to the extent of the cover-up that followed. Coming up,
Regression hypnosis, sodium pentothal, and truth serums used. Were they trying to uncover memories? Were they trying to scramble memories? Or was it a combination of the both?
Everyone involved in this was told, forget it. Didn't happen. Nothing to see.
The British government has long ago decided that all it knows about UFOs would never be acknowledged to the public. But will this policy of deception change after Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Halt apparently discovers actual evidence of a UFO landing site in Rendlesham Forest, complete with real-time audio recordings describing what he saw? After Halt's investigation is interrupted by yet another UFO sighting, he and his team follow the strange light through the woods. But then the object appears to break up into smaller pieces and suddenly vanish. Afterwards, other smaller white lights are seen sporadically in the night sky.
We hear on tape Colonel Halt and his team encounter the UFO themselves. Halt and his men discuss what they see. Bright light in the sky. This thing is zigzagging, forming extraordinary maneuvers.
While UFO researchers do not believe that Colonel Halt's audio recordings constitute definitive proof, they do consider them to be perhaps the best evidence yet of a close encounter with a UFO.
There's no doubt about it. This is weird.
The evidence is just outstanding. We have not only the caliber of the witnesses and the ongoing commentary from Colonel Holt, but they had Geiger counters going. They were testing for background radiation. They were looking at marks on the trees of where this craft would have come down. There was so much physical evidence.
There's no dispute about what actually took place. The recording is there. It's absolutely public record now.
Despite the evidence, or perhaps because of it, many of the military personnel involved in the Rendlesham Forest encounters believe a vast cover-up began almost immediately afterwards.
They didn't want this event to make the public domain. They definitely wanted to keep it quiet, so the cover-up, I would say it started pretty quickly.
After the Rendlesham Forest incident, one can clearly see the machinery of government going into action to downplay this and perhaps try to spin it as being of no defense significance. But we have, in the aftermath, extraordinary things happening.
According to UFO investigators, the extraordinary things included altering records, coercing witnesses, and disposing of the evidence of the UFO landing site.
Sergeant Penniston, it came out that he was brought in on more than one occasion, interrogated, and sodium pentothal was used. I don't have any memory of being brought in, interrogated, and there's been other people that said they were brought in, interrogated.
There are accusations made that regression hypnosis was used, sodium pentothal, and truth serum. Were they trying to uncover lost memories of the incident for the record? Or were they trying to scramble the witnesses' memories to suppress them, or was it a combination of the both?
Years after the Rendlesham incident, several airmen on duty those nights claimed they were ordered to sign false statements that concealed what they had witnessed.
Some of them have said that they were so intimidated by the chain of command that they just, almost literally with shaking hands, signed what was put in front of them.
If this is simply the British government wanting to write this off, why then would that require such a grandiose effort of a debriefing with sodium pentothal and threatening military personnel to the point of signing false statements, threatening careers, jail time? It's ridiculous.
Adding to the evidence of a massive cover-up, soon after the incident, the senior U.S. Air Force general in Europe made an unexpected impromptu visit to Bentwaters.
General Gabriel was briefed on the incident, and he took possession of a number of items of evidence relating to the case and took them back to his headquarters at Ramstein in Germany. And again, all this is beyond dispute because it's clearly recorded in the official Ministry of Defense file.
Per his own testimony years later, Deputy Base Commander Halt, at the time, was informed by the base commander that the military had no official interest in the incident. He was also told to hand the matter over to the British Ministry of Defense.
When the media contacted the Ministry of Defense, they said they glanced at the report but decided that there was nothing of defense interest. And they said that the US government came to the same conclusion. But the files show exactly the opposite. The files show a very detailed investigation was underway. The media might have been told one thing, but a very different thing was going on behind closed doors.
But why did the British government choose to cover up the Rendlesham encounters and conceal all evidence?
The answer is you have to explain it to the public, and neither of them want to do that.
Despite the denials by the UK government, despite the statements of no defense significance, this was taken extremely seriously. But everyone involved in this was told, forget it, didn't happen. nothing to see.
At the end of the day, I had no idea what it was other than what I saw I couldn't explain. And because I couldn't explain it, and I was young, and I was told by my superiors to let it go, drop it, be quiet about it, I did. But as the years evolved, people started talking, and more documents have come available and research. And there's definitely a phenomenon there that can't be explained totally.
The Rendlesham incident is one of the best in terms of the drama that actually happened. We have the documentation, we have very credible eyewitness testimony. It is an incredible case.
Yet officially, the British government has never acknowledged that what was witnessed in Rendlesham Forest may have been an extraterrestrial spacecraft. But what if explosive new evidence exists that while touching the craft, Staff Sergeant Peniston received a telepathic alien message? Coming up.
Peniston actually touched this object, and he received a telepathic download of information. Later, at home, he started to write page after page of ones and zeros.
Although the British government has repeatedly denied that a UFO landed in Rendlesham Forest in 1980, what if new evidence revealed that 3 decades later by the key witness, Jem Peniston, could prove what he has claimed all along?
It was only in 2010 that Jim Peniston finally revealed part of the story that he'd previously kept to himself. And that was that as he approached the craft and had this strange sensation of the air being thick with static charge, and saw in front of him these strange symbols on the side of the craft, which he likened to Egyptian hieroglyphs, he actually touched this object. He felt almost as if a shock suddenly went through his body. And he received what he subsequently called a telepathic download of information.
Moments later, the craft begins to glow. Then it rises silently up through the trees and disappears in the blink of an eye.
Later, at home, as if under some sort of strange compulsion, he took out his police notebook and he started to write page after page of ones and zeros. Now, he didn't know anything about ones and zeros at the time, and he really didn't think that this had any significance.
He began to write this all down as much as he could remember in notebooks, and it contains this vast, almost coded transmission that apparently came from the craft itself.
Without hesitating, Sergeant Peniston fills nearly 12 entire pages in his notebook. Immediately after finishing, he claims the codes were gone from his mind.
He talks about this almost being a compulsion that he was under, as if he had no control in it. And perhaps that had a role in him not speaking about it for years, or perhaps, of course, the fact that he stayed in the service after the incident also played a part in this.
For Sergeant Peniston and the rest of the world, it would be decades before this extraterrestrial code would, by chance, finally come to light. In 2010, at the 30th anniversary of the Rendlesham Forest incident.
Sergeant Peniston and I were sitting together at a table, and he started flipping through the notebook, talking about the pages. Well, he flipped the page over, and there was ones and zeros on it. And of course, everybody was like, what is that? And he's like, well, it's ones and zeros. They go, well, that's binary. And that's when the binary was first exposed by him.
Now keep in mind, in 1980, binary was really only known to a very small group of people in the computer world. But Peniston was not a mathematician or a computer programmer. This was just meaningless ones and zeros to him. And maybe that's why he kept it under wraps for so many years.
Software experts from 2 universities on separate continents eventually deciphered the binary code. Each confirmed the other's findings. And what UFO researchers learned about the Rendlesham Forest alien code is nothing short of stunning.
All I have is this claim that he received a binary code that gave him information on key geographical points on Earth.
But what might the alien code say about those locations? More incredibly, could this be the first time in history that extraterrestrials have communicated with a human? And might this decoded message reveal the origin of the UFO itself? Or might it reveal something entirely different? Some believe the Rendlesham craft may be from somewhere much closer than we could ever imagine. Despite 50 years of denials by the British government regarding Royal Air Force and other military encounters with UFOs, researchers believe the reality of alien visitation was established when Sergeant Jem Peniston touched an unknown craft in Rendlesham Forest and received a telepathic binary code, which he then wrote down in a notebook. But was this really a message from an extraterrestrial intelligence?
These ones and zeros that he received in this telepathic download were looked at by a computer scientist and programmer who did know binary code, and a translation was offered up. And the decoding of this Rendlesham code message is pretty bizarre. Line by line, the message reads as follows: exploration of humanity. Then there's a geographical coordinate. Continuous for planetary advance. Fourth coordinate, continuous, and then some garbled text, and then before. Then 6 more GPS coordinates.
Peniston received a binary code that gave him information on key geographical points on Earth, which are essentially like sacred sites.
The first GPS coordinates matched the location of Caracol, Belize, site of one of the greatest Maya ruins of Central America, and an ancient culture that believed in visitors from the stars that came down to Earth. Then there's Sedona, Arizona, world-renowned for its power of spiritual healing, and numerous sightings of UFOs reported there year after year. The next coordinate is the Giza Plateau, perhaps the greatest architectural achievement of the ancient world. Built with sacred geometry, the dimensions of the Great Pyramid precisely reflect those of Earth.
It's like all of these significant sites around the world are captured in the Rendlesham Code.
The fourth coordinate refers to the Nazca lines of Peru, drawn by ancient people on a sacred desert landscape. The figures are so large, they can only be recognized when looking down from the sky. Then there's Taishan-Kui, a sacred mountain believed to be the birthplace of the Chinese civilization 400,000 years ago. The last GPS coordinates point to the Temple of Apollo on the Greek island of Naxos. Believed to be a god in Greek mythology, Apollo would leave his temple 2 times a year, flying away in a heavenly chariot to faraway lands.
Why is it that sites of worship should turn up in the Rendlesham Code? It's stretching credulity beyond breaking point to suggest that this could be random.
All of these coordinates, they're all indications of sacred places on the planet, and that means that they have some connection to the gods, perhaps, to the space beings, and then that means that these sites actually have all been very closely connected to the extraterrestrial presence on Earth. So maybe the message is, we're here, and here's the proof of it.
For UFO researchers, the deciphered binary code is convincing evidence of contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence on British soil. But there is one final portion of the message, even more shocking than the rest.
Finally, the message reads, eyes of your eyes, a final GPS coordinate, then finally, origin year 8100. Well, that's 6,000 years in the future.
It said the year of origin was 8100, which indicates that maybe it's not extraterrestrials. Maybe it's time travelers from our future.
The craft were not alien or extraterrestrial, but from the future. So it's hard to really decipher what that means, but there's no question that it's an attempt to communicate perhaps about future events.
Is there a connection between Rendlesham, our far future, and our distant past? Is there something that links Rendlesham Forest with ancient civilizations and the sites that were most sacred to our ancestors, and something about the future?
Although we may never be sure what landed in Rendlesham Forest or why, the two men central to the case, John Burroughs and Jem Peniston, may have received insight some years later.
In the 90s, Jem Peniston went under hypnosis. Part of what came out in hypnosis was that they were time travelers from the future, and they're coming back to interact with us for some reason, which even could have to do with whatever happened in 1980 could affect the future.
People forget how serious the Cold War got in 1980, and I don't know that there was a real threat of a war breaking out, but there is a history of these objects affecting nuclear weapons. I can only assume that it had an intention of disabling the effectiveness of those nuclear weapons in this nuclear base, at least for that particular time.
If any nuclear weapons were disabled at the Air Force Base in 1980, neither the American nor British governments will ever say. But one thing is certain. Even since the Royal Air Force first faced off against a UFO 50 years ago, there's been overwhelming evidence that UFOs have been sighted by the military and denied by the government for nearly half a century. The only question remaining is whether such spacecraft are visiting from distant worlds or from our future.